All right, it is 2:30, so let us begin. My name is Martin Davies. For the, I mean, I know several of you know that, but I'm the director of the Maritime program here. And what I have started out with up on the screen here is the title of a book written some years ago by a journalist named Rose George, and you've all been looking at this title for some time now, 90% of everything. And the subtitle, I don't know how easy it is to read her subtitle, but the subtitle is Inside Shipping, the invisible industry that puts clothes on your back, gas in your car, and food on your plate. Now, the shipping business has been not quite so invisible of late because there's been a lot of news about supply chain problems, but Rose George's basic point is that 90% of everything you wear, that you eat, that you drink your coffee from, has probably been on a ship. And so I started too soon. See, look, I waited till 2:30 and then, like, sorry. Other than that, shipping is really important, more important than many people realize. And so these measures that I'm about to describe to you, that the shipping industry is going to have to implement are really significant. This is, to describe this as the hot topic in the shipping industry at the moment would be to understate it. This is approaching a sort of an obsession for ship operators at the moment, for reasons that you'll see. I don't think it's crossed the desk of too many maritime lawyers just yet. Partly because it hasn't happened yet, but I think it will before too long. So it being decarbonization. So let me just switch to my overheads. Here. Sorry. There we go. Reducing carbon emissions in the shipping industry. It doesn't sound very exciting, I must admit, but well, I think everything about ships is exciting. Okay, so the outline of what I'm going to cover. First of all, I'm going to describe what these new regulations are, but just to sort of make my statement at the very outset here, as so far as I'm aware, these are the first internationally uniform, legally binding regulations about decarbonization. My colleague Gunther Handel will probably tell me that I'm wrong about that because he's the international environmental lawyer. But these are not, I mean, there's been a lot of news about the Glasgow Committee, whatever it's called, COP, and undertakings that countries are making to one another. Well, these are not undertakings. These are going to be law. It's not politics. These are actually going to be enforceable regulations. And there are two sets of them that I'm going to talk about. One is from the, one set of regulations comes from the International Maritime Organization, which many of you, I'm sure most will know, is they call it a specialized agency of the United Nations. The IMO regulations are going to come into effect from 2023, 1st of January 2023, which is really not very far away now. And the European Union regulations will also come into effect in 2023. So I'm going to describe what these new regulations are, how they're going to work. And they are what are called performance-based regulations, which is that they're not regulations that say you have to do the following things. They're regulations that say you have to get to the following place, and we don't really care how you get there. Right? So there are different methods of complying with these regulations, and I'm going to describe a few of those different methods, mainly the alternative fuels that people are considering, and some operational measures as well. And then I'm going to deal with how all of this is going to be paid for. Now, what's been going on in Washington, the debates about infrastructure have made us all a little bit more blasé about the use of the word trillion, but this is going to cost trillions of dollars. This is not government expenditure. It's not government spending your taxes and mine. This is all private commercial investment, and it's going to have to come from somewhere. And ESG investing, I'm guessing everybody knows environmental social governance investing, different types of investors who are concerned to direct their money to, in this case, environmentally friendly sources, and also the possibility of carbon taxes. So that's the outline of what I'm going to cover. By the way, if there are any questions as I go along, please feel free to ask. I mean, I'll take questions at the end as well if you would like. But okay, to begin then with the IMO strategy. The IMO, as I said, is the agency of the United Nations, and it has several committees. And one of the committees, more than several actually, but one of the committees is called the Marine Environment Protection Committee, MEPC. And at the IMO and the United Nations, they sort of number their meetings. So there's an MEPC 75 in November of 2020. The MEPC adopted these draft amendments to a convention that you may have heard of, generally called MARPOL, which is the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. And the purpose of MARPOL, well, it's pretty obvious from the title, is to prevent pollution from ships. And when it was first made in 1973, the concern was to prevent oil pollution from ships. There have been several sort of high-profile oil spills in the late 60s and early 70s. But as I'll show you, oil pollution is no longer the principal concern of MARPOL. Now, 160 countries in the world, including the United States, are party to MARPOL. So basically, every country in the world, over 98% of the world's tonnage is registered in countries that are party to MARPOL. So this is everywhere.
Including China.
Yep. Now, so what MARPOL will do, the amendments that I'm going to show you, is to cut the carbon intensity of emissions from all existing ships. I've got all in sort of little red letters here, because that's a big deal, like all ships above 400 gross tons. Now, 400 gross tons is not a big ship. And for example, most of the offshore supply vessels working out in the Gulf of Mexico would be more than 400 gross tons. So all ships will have to comply with this, except the really little ones, right? And the aim is to reduce the carbon intensity of international shipping emissions by 40% by 2030 and 70% by 2050. And these regulations were actually made, so the draft was distributed in November 2020, and the regulations were actually made in June 2021, so just 5 months ago, at MEPC 76. And these are new mandatory measures. Now, they do not come into force until 1st January 2023, because it's going to take time for ship owners to figure out how they're going to comply with this. But trust me, they're paying a lot of attention to this right now, because 1st of January 2023, not very far away. And the IMO strategy uses two different measures. First is obviously total greenhouse gas emissions. That's on, everybody's discussing that at the moment, but also carbon intensity. And as I'll shortly explain to you, carbon intensity is actually the measure that's more important in these regulations. And what carbon intensity is, I guess fairly obvious, but it's the amount of carbon emitted per deadweight ton mile. Now, I think for those of you who are not maritime lawyers, I think I'm going to have to explain what a deadweight ton mile is. Deadweight tonnage of a ship is the tonnage of cargo it can carry. So the other regulations, when I talked about 400 gross tons, the gross tonnage is the weight of the ship itself. Deadweight tonnage is the weight of cargo it can carry. And for most ships, the deadweight tonnage is going to be more than the gross tonnage. Most ships can carry more than their own weight, so to speak, right? And so the measure of carbon intensity is you look at for every deadweight ton that the ship can carry, how much carbon does it emit per mile that the ship travels, right? So that's the carbon intensity. And even if intensity decreases, and the measures that have been put in place are designed to reduce the intensity of carbon emissions, total emissions will continue to increase if there are more ships sailing around. And there will have to be more ships sailing around between now and 2050. Why? Well, there are going to be more people. As it says at the bottom, more than 80% of the world's trade in goods is carried by sea. So all of international trade is done by sea. The world population is currently 7.8 billion people. But the UN projects that by 2050, it will be 9.7 billion people. That's a 23% increase by the time this target is going to have to be met. So there are going to have to be more ships because there's going to have to be more trade. Now, that small point at the final bullet point here. In the year that I was born, and I'm going to be coy enough not to tell you what year that was, but in the year that I was born, the world population was 2.8 billion people, right, which is 35% of what it is now. So the world population has almost tripled in my lifetime, which is a fairly sort of mind-blowing thought. Right? So more people, more ships, more emissions. Right? And so I've borrowed this graph, and just to give credit where credit is due, this is a simple enough graph, but it's easier to cut and paste it than to make one of my own. Was made by the Norwegian Classification Society, DNV, Det Norske Veritas. I'll explain a little bit what classification societies are if you don't already know, but the point of the graph is the starting point is 2008. So you have to have a point, a starting point by which you measure the reduction. And the starting point is the emissions in 2008. And the blue line is what happens if we don't do anything. Right? And more and more and more and more emissions. Right? The green line is supposed to illustrate what happens if the IMO strategy is correctly implemented, i.e. people actually follow these regulations. And if you look, where's my little pointer here? If you look at 2020 here, which we've of course already passed 2020, the line between 2020 and 2030 is flat, which means that the total amount of emissions will remain pretty much the same, even if the percentage reduction by 2030 is 40%. So if carbon intensity is reduced by 40%, the total number of emissions is going to remain pretty much the same. Now, what then happens, ideally, is that when by the time we get to 2050, if carbon intensity has been reduced by 70%, that will produce a reduction of 50% in total emissions. And then the thing that I rather like about the IMO's strategy is it says, and after 2050, we'll get to zero like whenever we can, as soon as we can. So they're not really thinking beyond 2050, but this is the goal of these regulations. Okay, so carbon intensity, the important measure. The legal instrument that's being used to do this is Annex 6 of MARPOL. Remember MARPOL, the international convention that everybody's party to. Annex 6 was introduced in 2005. It was revised in 2010. So it's really not all that old when you compare it with MARPOL. And what Annex 6 did is to sort of change the focus of MARPOL, or at least add to the focus of MARPOL, because the initial focus of MARPOL was oil pollution, prevention of oil pollution. Annex 6 is about air pollution. And the jargon that's used in relation to Annex 6 is up there at the top of the screen. SOx, NOx, and PM. What SOx, NOx, and PM are? SOx is oxides of sulfur, NOx is oxides of nitrogen, PM is particulate matter. And Annex 6 was designed to reduce air pollution by SOx, NOx, and PM. And it produced this sliding downward scale of permitted emissions of these air pollutants. Now, the important thing to understand is they are not greenhouse gases. Nitrogen dioxide is not a greenhouse gas. Sulfur dioxide is not a greenhouse gas. And by the way, these limits on the emissions, although we're not really here to talk about SOx, NOx, and PM, these limits were significantly lowered on the 1st of January 2020. And that in itself has cost ship operators a lot of money. Now they have to be buying very low sulfur fuel oil, which is more costly and so on. But the point is that this is the vehicle by which these new greenhouse gas regulations have been introduced. There are amendments to Annex 6, even though Annex 6 wasn't initially about climate change. And as I've said, they're performance-based regulations. And they're modeled on something that's been enforced since 2013. I describe these regulations as being the first internationally uniform, legally enforceable regulations, but there have actually been regulations in place since 2013 about new buildings is the reason, the word that for some reason we always use, new buildings being newly launched ships. And since 2013, new buildings have had to have this thing called an EEDI, an Energy Efficiency Design Index, which basically is the maximum permitted quantity of carbon dioxide per ton mile. Remember the ton mile measure, right? And that maximum permitted quantity is, ratcheted down over time. But as I said, the regulations just say, well, you've got to reach that number, and how you get there is up to you. That's been in place for new buildings since 2013. The new thing that's going to come into force from 2023 is that all ships above 400 gross registered tons will have to have something that they've decided to call an EEXI, which apparently stands for Energy Efficiency Existing Ship Index, which you would think should really be EESI, but they wanted to make it sound like EEDI, so it's the EEXI, presumably everybody's going to call it the EEXI or something like that. And what that is the carbon intensity indicator, the CII. Sorry for all this jargon, but it's pretty obvious what all these things are. And what the CII is a required reduction factor of carbon emissions. And so essentially all ships over 400 gross tons are going to have to measure their carbon emissions, record their carbon emissions per deadweight ton mile. And then their annual operational CII is documented and rated. It's just like law school, A, B, C, D, E. There's no F, by the way. You can't fail, but so it's going to be rated every year. And if the rating is low, improvement action is going to have to take place. So if you get 2 Ds in a row, you've got to do better. You'll not be allowed to trade unless you fix whatever is causing you to get a D. 1 E will require you to fix things. Okay, and these operational ratings are going to be done by the flag state. Now, the flag state is the country in which the ship is registered, because that's the flag state is the primary enforcer of all regulations relating to ships. But as you probably know, some flag states are rather better at it than others. To give you an example, and I don't mean to be rude, I really don't mean to be rude, but the second largest registry in the world at the moment, by tonnage registered there, is the Marshall Islands. Now, the Marshall Islands has a population of 58,000. That's about 1/6 the size of Orleans Parish, right? So they obviously don't have a huge workforce of people that might be able to enforce these regulations. So many countries, like the Marshall Islands, subcontract the enforcement to classification societies like DNV or the American Bureau of Shipping. So whoever enforces this, though, whether it's the flag state itself or a subcontractor of the flag state, they're going to get these letter grades. But the important thing to understand is, as well as this possibly spotty enforcement from flag states, there will be port state enforcement as well, port state control. And what port state's obvious what that is, that's the port, that's the country of the port that the ship is visiting. And I think it's entirely possible that some ports will say, you've got a D, you can't come in here. Right? It's like those restaurant recommendations, you know, like who wants to eat at the restaurant that got an E, right? I think it's distinctly possible that some ports may decide to bar entry to ships that have consistently poor ratings. Now, as I've already said, the operators are already considering implementation measures because they have to get working on this right now. There's all sorts of things being considered in combination, retrofitting the existing ships, possibly to use alternative fuels, and operational measures. And that's my second sort of theme. What could be done to all these ships to make them comply by 2023? Before we get to that, though, I also have to describe the EU system. You may think, well, who cares what the EU is doing? But it's actually quite important because it's going to apply to ships trading in and out of the EU, which is a lot of ships. The European Commission announced on 14 July 2021, again, just 5 months ago, that shipping would be gradually introduced into the emissions trading system. Now, the ETS, the emissions trading system, already exists in the European Union. The thing that has been changed here is that shipping is now going to be phased into the ETS. And it's a carbon market that operates in all EU countries. And the aim is achieving climate neutrality by 2050. Now, that's much more far-reaching than the IMO's goal. And indeed, the IMO has been criticized in some areas by being not ambitious enough. The EU has set this ambitious goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. And so starting in 2023, 100% of shipping emissions from voyages entirely within the EU and 50% of voyages to and from will be in the ETS. And what it is, it's just a cap and trade system. I think most people probably know how cap and trade works, that each carbon emitter, each ship is given an EUA, an EU allowance of how much it can emit. And then the cap is the overall greenhouse emissions are capped and reduced over time. And participants can trade their EUA. So if you lower your emissions, you can then sell your excess allowance. And if you're over the limit, you have to pay more. Yeah.
Does this only apply to commercial shipping or does it apply to military shipping?
It doesn't apply to military ships, right? It doesn't apply to military ships. That is a long story, but no, no. All commercial ships over 400 gross tons. Now, the fines are rather eye-watering. I don't know if you can see at the bottom of the screen there. Yes?
Is that ships in the domestic trade too?
Yeah, all ships.
So Jones Act
all
ships?
All ships. Because
Carnival cruises.
yeah, all ships over 400 gross tons. That's why I'm trying to give you the impression this is actually quite a big deal, right? I think we're getting there. The fines are 100 euros per kilogram of excess CO2 emitted. That's not per ton, that's per kilogram. There are 1,000 kilograms in a ton. So for every ton that you are over your limit, you will be fined 100,000 euros. It's fairly sort of will attract the attention of operators going in and out of Europe. Now, there's a maritime financial research firm called Drury that has estimated the total cost of the EU scheme, not the IMO scheme as well, just the EU scheme, for some of the largest ship operators in the world. And what they did is they took the total emissions for those operators in 2020 and worked out what would it have cost them under the new regime in 2023. And for Maersk, which is the largest shipping line in the world, the answer is $407 million, which is about 10% of its earnings before interest and taxes. Right? And that's a significant, expenditure before interest and taxes. Right? CMA CGM, the large French line, 280 million, Hapag-Lloyd, 154 million. These are big numbers. But these are the estimates for 2023. And in 2023, only 20% of emissions are actually going to be liable under the scheme. That's going to go up. 45% in 2024, 70% in 2025, 100% in 2026. So you can imagine if you're Maersk, you're figuring out how the heck you're going to do this because it's going to cost a lot of money, right? That's just the EU scheme. Now, let's talk about the alternative fuel sources, which is one way of doing it. As you'll see, CMA CGM is already doing that. Liquefied natural gas, LNG, ammonia, hydrogen, biofuels, which are vegetable-based oils, including, amazingly, recycled cooking oil. You can run your ship on recycled cooking oil. And wind is another. There are lots, but I'm just going to talk about these. The general expectation at the moment seems to be that LNG is the medium-term solution, but others are a long-term necessity. Yes?
Didn't Maersk though decide to leapfrog LNG? They decided not to rely on it.
I'm absolutely getting to that, yeah. But so LNG is not the ideal solution, and maybe like leapfrogging it is a good idea, right? But the story with LNG, and all of these have pros and cons, all of these alternative fuel sources. LNG is not a particularly viable solution for existing ships because there's quite a lot of retrofitting is needed. It's fine for new buildings. You launch your ship now with LNG bunkers. But the principal problem is that LNG is not carbon free. It does emit about 25 to 30% less CO2. But that's not, like a massive reduction when compared with traditional marine fuels. It also has the advantage, no SOx, NOx, or PM. So let's not forget about them while we're at it. And to show an indicator of the increasing demand for LNG, in 2019, there were 34 LNG bunkering ports. Bunkers, by the way, I should have explained. Bunkers is just the name that you use for any fuel that the ship is oh, thank you. Any fuel that the ship is burning, we call bunkers. And the process of loading in is bunkering. There were only 34 LNG bunkering ports in the world in 2019, but there are 96 now. So there's obviously increase, and 55 in development, which is a clear indicator of increasing demand. By the way, the largest LNG bunkering port in the United States is Port Fourchon. The Port of New Orleans will begin to offer LNG bunkers by the end of 2022. But there are drawbacks. I mean, it's not a perfect solution because it's not carbon free. There's also the possibility of something that I'm, as you probably tell, British, and therefore I call this methane, and you would call it methane, right? But it's possible for there to be methane slip, which is unburned methane in the exhaust. And methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So this is not a perfect solution, but it is the medium-term solution. Now, I said CMA CGM is doing this. This ship is the CMA CGM JACQUES. It's the 6th largest container ship in the world. Jacques SAADE, by the way, was the founder of CMA CGM. And this number, 23,112 TEUs, TEU stands for 20-foot equivalent unit. 20-foot container is 1 TEU. 40-foot containers, the ones on the front here are probably 40-foot containers. But 23,000 TEUs, it's a very big ship, entirely powered by LNG. As you can see, it says, well, perhaps you can't, but it says proudly on the side, LNG powered. Right? So this is the largest LNG powered ship in the world, and there are, others, of course. But as your question indicated, it is not expected to be the long-term solution. And there is a nice little seed in the wind about this. which is because it's doubtful whether switching to LNG, if all the ships in the world switch to LNG, we still wouldn't reach the IMO targets. Yes?
Have actually done studies, perhaps on that ship, about the frequency of the methane slips and if it actually is offsetting enough?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's a possibility, but presumably the efficiency of the engines will have something to do with that. But I quite like this example about the problems of LNG because the world's first ever LNG powered ship is an offshore supply vessel. That's what OSV is, offshore supply vessel in the North Sea, operating out of Norway. It was launched in 2003, so it's quite old, but it was an LNG powered ship and it's being converted away from LNG. Which is kind of a telling little fact. By the way, Viking Energy, it's called, that's 1,500 tons. So it's not a very big ship, but it gives you some idea that a 400-ton ship is really not at all big. And so Viking Energy was converted to a hybrid system in 2016, and it's going to be using an ammonia fuel cell by 2024. So ammonia is low energy density, so it takes up more space than diesel or fuel oil per amount of propulsive power. And so if you were to retrofit existing ships to use ammonia, you'd lose cargo space, and it would be costly. There are no new buildings that I know of yet, but there are some in development. There's no carbon in ammonia, which is good. But it does need pilot fuel to make it burn. So you're going to have to use a carbon-based fuel just to make it burn. So it's not entirely carbon neutral. The important thing about about ammonia is you can convert an LNG burning ship into an ammonia burning ship quite easily. So that may well be the future for CMA CGM JACQUES SAADE, for example, that it will become an ammonia burning ship. Hydrogen also carbon-free, and also no SOx, NOx, or PM. There's plentiful production of hydrogen already, but almost all the world's global hydrogen production is sourced by the use of fossil fuels. So it's what they call gray hydrogen, not green hydrogen. And there's not very much green hydrogen being produced at the moment, not yet plentiful production of green hydrogen. Yes?
So, yeah, so the difference though is you still have carbon that comes out of the conversion from LNG to ammonia, but there are technologies in place now to capture the carbon, right? So that could be implemented.
Yeah, like there's all sorts of things that they're considering. Absolutely, the carbon capture is a distinct possibility, and carbon capture would be really good in the EU emission trading scheme, for example. Because you could actually make money out of.
But that would still be considered gray or blue, not
right.
But that would be blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen.
But so the problem is green hydrogen. I think, of course, hydrogen is like colorless. But you're talking about the total global total carbon footprint of not just what's produced on the ship, but the production of the fuel to get to the ship. It is more different from existing fuels than LNG and ammonia are. So, and you'd need this sort of land-based infrastructure costs. And it's not all that easy to retrofit existing ships. Biofuels, this in some way, these sound like the ideal solution. These are vegetable oils produced from plant oils like rapeseed, soybean, palm oil. Palm oil, not a particularly environmentally friendly oil, but the vegetable oils you can burn. And you can burn them in existing engines. And this is the major sort of advantage because it's the so-called drop-in substitute. There's up to 90% reduction in CO2, no SOx, NOx, or PM. And the drop-in nature of this is illustrated by these two ships here. The top one is a tanker named Eastern Pacific. No, sorry, the ship is named Pacific Beryl. It's operated by Eastern Pacific. The bottom one is a container ship called MOL Experience, operated by the consortium ONE. they've both done actual commercial voyages using entirely biofuels. So not sort of test runs, but actual commercial cargo carrying voyages using biofuels. So this is obviously a very attractive alternative. The problem is, so far there's a lack of sustainable supply. That the current production covers only about 15% of the energy demands of shipping. So if this is the future, we're going to have to start ramping up production pretty soon. Operational measures, again, lots. I don't have time to talk about all of them. Slow steaming reduces emissions, and the MEPC actually, for a while, considered imposing a speed limit, which they didn't. But going more slowly than the ship can is a way of reducing fuel consumption and therefore reducing emissions. Now, the contracts for commercial disposition of a vessel, time charters, always have a provision in it called a speed and consumption warranty, the speed and consumption warranty being something that the charterer is concerned about. How fast can the ship go? How much fuel does it burn? Because that affects how many voyages the commercial operator can complete during during a year, for example. To give you an example, and I'm sorry, I'm sure lots of you know about maritime law, but in case you don't, to use an example that everybody's going to remember, the Ever Given, which is the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Right? It had Evergreen painted all across the side. Evergreen was the commercial operator of that vessel, not the physical operator of the vessel. Evergreen, a Taiwanese company, it's owned and operated by a Japanese company. So Evergreen's concern is, how much money can I make out of this, because I'm not running the ship. The charterer does have to buy the fuel. Much like when you rent a car, you have to buy the gasoline and pay the toll fees and everything. The running costs are paid for by the charterer, but the ship is actually operated by the owner. Now, historically, disputes about speed and consumption used to be the charterers complaining that the ship doesn't go fast enough, or that it would burn too much fuel. Like, I'm not getting as many voyages in as I expected. So that's your traditional speed and consumption dispute. Now, it's quite often the charterer who wants the ship to go slowly because the ship burns less fuel, and of course the charterer is the one that has to buy the fuel. Owners don't really like going really slowly because it can damage the engine. And so now time charter contracts have begun to use slow steaming clauses, or even ultra slow steaming clauses, which give the charterer the right to dictate the ship's speed or revolutions per minute. And so it is an interesting thought. There are ships sailing around out there at walking pace, because this saves the charterer money and reduces the emissions. Virtual arrival, same kind of thing. This is not exactly rocket science, and I think virtual arrival is a strange name, but this is what the clauses are called. What virtual arrival clauses are, again, fairly obvious. There's no point in barreling across the Pacific at full speed if you're then going to have to wait for 2 weeks before you get into port, because you're still going to have to be burning fuel while you're waiting. And so what virtual arrival clauses do is to slow down the speed of the ship so that it arrives at the moment that it's ready to get into port. And again, another simple little graph, that if you start off at full speed and then discover on day 3 that you're not going to get in as soon as you get there, you simply slow down. So that the brown bars are the full speed and the green bars are you've slowed down. And this example, the ship arrives only 3 days later than it was first expected to arrive, and uses 43% less bunkers, which is a significant reduction And so virtual arrival, very sensible. But again, you have to put this provision in the contract because otherwise the ship owner's obligation is actually to go as fast as it can. So these are just a couple of the operational things that can be done. Hull coating is another. That reduces friction, makes the ship propeller casings, kites and sails, lots of possibilities. And each of them, you know, sort of saves you a little bit. And that's what performance-based regulations are all about. We don't care how you get there, as long as you get there. Okay, how is this all going to be paid for? Well, as I said, the estimates are that it will cost between 1.4 and 1.9 trillion dollars to reach the IMO's goals. I don't know how you estimate that, to be honest, but that's the number that's being bandied about. It's going to require land-based infrastructure as well as modifications to the ships. Now, to give you some idea of what $1.9 trillion feels like, not a lot of money to Washington, D.C., apparently, but there are about 53,000 commercial trading vessels in the world at the moment. And if you divided that number just equally among the 53,000 ships, it would come to $26 million to $36 million per ship. Now, trust me, most of those 53,000 ships are not worth $26 million, right? And that's just if you divide it equally. I mean, this is to give you some sense of the magnitude of this. And how is all this going to be paid for? Well, some of the traditional lenders have been leaving the industry already. The traditional lenders would be sort of European and Scandinavian banks loaning money. Traditionally, ship financing has been debt financing rather than equity. And between 2008 and 2019, 2008, obviously, the global financial crisis persuaded some banks that this was no longer a business that they wanted to have anything to do with. Between 2008 and 2019, the top 40 shipping finance banks reduced their portfolios by 36%. So a lot of the European banks, the traditional European lenders, have been getting out before all of this started. Some Asian banks have been getting in, but the traditional methods of ship financing, and it's not going to work if that's how this is going to be funded. And as I've said, ESG financing is coming in, and the possibility of carbon taxes, although, as you can imagine, the implementation of that would be quite something. ESG financing, as I said, you probably know, environmental, social, and governance. This is something quite impressive, actually, I find. There are these things called the Poseidon principles. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Poseidon principles before. But these were developed by ship owners and financiers. And what they do is to provide a framework for incorporating environmental considerations rather, into lending decisions. And have I got my, no, I don't have. There's a website, poseidonprinciples.org, that you could go and look at. And what the principles are, just briefly, are assessment, accountability, enforcement, transparency. And basically what the lenders are saying, those who have signed on to the Poseidon principles, are saying we are going to assess your carbon footprint, the carbon intensity of the people to whom we are lending the money. We're going to hold you accountable. We're going to enforce the principles by using appropriate data and information to give to you, and this is one that I find quite impressive, actually, and require your consent to be given to sharing your information with other people, which is like quite good. And then also transparency. Everybody must publicly state that they're a signatory to the Poseidon principles. Now, I said these are not government driven. This is not the IMO doing this. This is the lenders doing this themselves. At the moment, most of the signatories to the Poseidon principles are European and Scandinavian banks. I've got a list of them there, if that means anything to you. But there's some American in there. There are some Japanese. ING Bank is a big Danish lender. Well, you can see the list. There's some familiar names there, and all of these have signed on to the Poseidon principles, and therefore are using those standards in their lending decisions. There will be new sources of capital. As I said, the traditional model of ship financing has been debt financing secured by a simple ship mortgage from one bank. That is changing very much. Ship financing is diversifying, particularly since 2008. Different models in different parts of the world. There is an increased number of financial leasing companies, which are like sale and leaseback. Chinese lenders like to do that. There's private equity, more equity funding than there ever used to be, mainly from US investors, interestingly. Collateralized loan obligations. There is an International Capital Markets Association has also got green loan principles. So there's a lot of movement that is sort of unfamiliar to the way ship financing was traditionally done. There is the possibility of a carbon tax, which would steer companies towards low greenhouse gas fuels by taxing the higher ones. And again, this is some more jargon. The well-to-propeller basis measures the total footprint, carbon footprint, from taking it out of the ground or taking it out of the factory or whatever it is until it's burned on the ship. So biofuels, for example, are lower emitters once they're on the ship, but they do have a higher carbon intensity during production, right? In harvesting the feedstocks, for example. So the simple concept is to require payment of a fee based on the amount of carbon emitted. That's not rocket science either. That's what a carbon tax would be. But you think, well, how is every country in the world going to like play along with this? But interestingly, there is a model that might be used, which is something called the IOPC funds. The United States is not a contributor to the IOPC funds, but the IOPC is International Oil Pollution Convention funds. And countries that have adopted the fund convention tax a small amount every ton of oil that is imported into the country. And then they contribute that to the fund. And the fund is actually a legal entity based in London. And it exists now, this humongous pool of money, by the way, because they haven't actually paid out anything for a long time. So every country that signs onto the fund taxes imports and then contributes to this international fund. So there is actually a model that might work as the basis for collecting this carbon tax. But the big question is, where would the money go? The Marshall Islands, as I told you, has actually made a proposal at the IMO suggesting a tax of $100 US dollars per ton of CO2 emissions. And that would raise about $91 billion a year. But under the Marshall Islands proposal, the money wouldn't go to the ship operators. The proposal is that 51% would go to countries most in danger from climate change, which just happens to include the Marshall Islands, right? 33% would go to research and development, 16% to port states. The point being that there is actually a concrete proposal at the IMO, unlikely ever to be adopted, but for a carbon tax. Another thing that I find really interesting, Trafigura, which is a major ship charterer based in Singapore. So Trafigura is, remember, what that means is it's the consumer of shipping services. And it has proposed a carbon tax of $250 to $300 per ton. So basically, Trafigura is saying, charge us more for chartering your ships. And the traffic Euro scheme is what they call a fee-bait system. And of course, not surprisingly, given the traffic Euro is in the business of operating ships, the money in the traffic Euro scheme would go to ship operators. That the IMO would set a CII carbon intensity benchmark, and if you're above the benchmark, you have to pay the tax, and if you're below the benchmark, you get paid. It's much like a cap and trade scheme. But what the traffic Euro scheme is a redistribution of wealth from high emitters to low emitters. So anyway, this is, people are talking in the shipping business, at least they're talking about carbon taxes, but the big question is, well, who gets the money? Okay, so my conclusion. The decarbonization measures in the shipping industry, this is not aspirational anymore. This is fairly soon going to be operational. This is not, undertakings by governments that this is what we're going to do by 2050. These are concrete, legally enforceable measures that are coming to force quite soon that will require substantial changes in the way ships are operated, which is why this is actually, like I said, quite a big deal. Right? And ship operators have to make decisions now about the future life of the ship. Like you talked about what Maersk is doing now, because the normal, the rule of thumb that people think about the operational life of a trading ship is about 15 to 20 years. If you launch a ship now, that means it's going to be, sailing until late 2030s, early 2040s. Everything will be different by then. So ship operators have to make decisions now with a view to increasingly stringent carbon emission regulations. And I said, this is not politics, this is law. These are going to be enforceable regulations that they have to comply with in the future life of the ship. And so, as I said, they are intensely focused on this at the moment, they being the ship operators, because it's not all that far away. Right? And everybody is wary, as you can probably imagine, of making the wrong choice, betting on the wrong horse. To use an example, I mean, I was coy enough not to tell you earlier on how old I am, but there's probably enough people in the room old enough to know that you don't want to be buying like a Betamax VH, when the industry standard is going to be VHS, right? And so everybody's worried about buying the Betamax video recorder, right? But you have to bet on a horse now. You have to bet on a horse now. And so, final bullet point before I'll take any questions if there are any others. As you can probably imagine, that was a sort of like I ripped through it all at some pace, but there are going to be a significant number of legal issues for maritime lawyers here, a significant number. Mainly, it seems to me at the moment, mainly for transactional people, because there are all kinds of new deals going to have to be made, rather than, I can't picture yet what the litigation issues might be, but this is going to transform the way that international shipping is done. And coming back to where I started with Rose George and 90% of everything, it's going to make 90% of everything more expensive than it presently is, because wherever this money comes from, the cost is going to get passed on to you and me eventually. Okay? Any questions other than the ones that I've already? Yes.
So you alluded to this earlier when you talked about biofuels, but what about the supply side? Say they invest $2 trillion in retrofitting and getting new ships out. Are there going to be sufficient suppliers of green hydrogen?
That's the big question. Because as I said, as I went through, the costs are not just in retrofitting the ships and like building new ships, because there are going to be land-based infrastructure costs, which presumably may be paid by governments, I don't know, or commercial operators. But again, the biofuels, the seller, is also worried about betting on the wrong horse. Like as you say, you invest $1 squillion in infrastructure to deliver biofuel bunkers, and then everybody ends up using something else. Yeah. Yes.
Is there a nuclear horse?
There is. It's not. it's because military ships use nuclear fuels. I haven't seen a lot of discussion about commercial ships using nuclear energy, to be honest. And you know, there are some places like the Panama Canal won't let you go through. You know, so
New Zealand. New Zealand periods.
yeah, New Zealand, right? Can't go anywhere near New Zealand. It's not a big. Not a big part of the shipping business, New Zealand, but yeah. So, I mean, everything is being considered, right? Like all sorts of little things as well as big things. But it does seem like the big thing is alternative fuels. That within 20 years, perhaps, or possibly even less, they'll not be burning oil at all. And maybe they won't even be burning LNG anymore. Yes?
Of all these fuels, which ones are safer, subject to explosion or volatility?
I think the answer to that is ammonia, because these are ammonia-based fuel cells for the most part, like Viking Energy is going to be using. It's like a giant battery. You know? I think that's the safest one. I'm sure nuclear fuel is fairly safe, but it just doesn't have that feel about it. Yes?
Is there ag supply for biofuels at this scope?
No, that's the problem with biofuels, right? I mean,
Popeyes.
yeah, you got to recycle all of that, right? Yeah. No, as I said, at the moment it's only about 15%, and most of that is in Europe, and most of that is in Rotterdam. Right? But it would be possible to ramp up production, but you could then get the Betamax problem. You don't want to be betting on the wrong horse.
And do you see biofuels as a solution for the trucking emissions? I know that's a big thing in California that's messing up the supply chain out of Cali.
I don't know. Because I know that you can burn biofuels in a ship engine. I don't know that you can drop it into a car engine.
There's some buses that have switched to biofuels. There's some metropolitan areas have switched city buses.
So existing, because that's why it sounds like the best option, because it's the so-called drop-in option. It's just there's not enough production. And look, you have to get it from things like palm oil. It's kind of not very environmentally friendly, you know, and plant huge, you know, fields full of rapeseed and stuff. He looks like he wants me to stop. Okay.
It's hard to do to such a, we do want to thank Martin.